Hello and welcome to this video on naming conventions. When we program code, we should pay particular attention to the naming and style conventions we use. Generally, the code will work if your naming conventions are poor, but is that an excuse not to worry about it? Essentially, naming conventions are a set of rules and guidelines that you follow when coding your application. Good naming conventions usually translate to good code quality, such as readability. In this case, if you can read your code, then you are on the right track. Good code is self-commented. If you make use of lots of code comments, then clearly your readability is not good. If you look at a code block and have little to no idea of how the data is being interacted with, then usually this is down to poor naming. The next one is maintainability. We need to ensure our program can be maintained from time to time, be it upgrades, bug fixes, etc. If your naming conventions are poor, then this will take longer to try and understand what the code is doing. The next one is consistency. You should be able to look at the code and see that it flows well. You should instantly recognize what a variable might be or what a function is, and this is through consistent naming. Again, poor standards mean that it may take longer to take it, literally because you're not consistent. For example, in a function you might use snake case, and in another you might use Pascal case when dealing with variables. In that case, you are no longer being consistent, so always stick to one rule. So let's have a look at some code, one without good naming conventions and one with better naming conventions. Technically speaking, both of these will do exactly the same job. The top one is much more difficult to read than the bottom one, and that is because we are not using very naming conventions here. For example, batui.bob and batui.ashok do not make sense. Int num is very ambiguous in meaning. So when we look at the bottom one, we have battle UI dot update enemy UI, battle UI update dialog. So these now make more sense. One of them is to update the enemy interface and one of them is to update the dialog interface. The num is actually for damage, so we can see that we are dealing damage to a player. So again, both of these would work exactly the same. The only difference is the way I've named the bottom one just makes it that little bit more readable. So do they differ in terms of conventions? You should follow the conventions where possible that are set out by the standards of the language and framework that you are using. However, in some instances, your employer may have their own set of standards, which of course you should adopt to make sure you are on their workflow. So what is the basis of a good naming convention? Well, we need to make the intent clear, i.e. what does it do? We do not want to misguide a variable's use by using a poor identifier. For example, Bob is not a very good identifier for a variable. Functions and method names should be a verb, i.e. they are doing something, and class names should be a noun. You generally need to follow a styling guide. For example, you might have camel case or lower camel case, snake case and Pascal case, otherwise known as upper camel case. You will learn about functions and methods and classes in later on in the course, and then it will become clear why we use nouns and verbs. But in the meantime, let's just take a look at some examples of naming conventions. Let's start with lower camel case, otherwise referred to as camel case. In this one, if our variable has multiple words, such as lower camel case, then what we're doing here is the first letter in the first word will be lowercase. Then every other word afterwards, its first letter will be uppercase. This is a convention we often see in the naming of our C# variables. So we could say something like sphere volume, for example. And there we go. And in this case, it's all joined together. There are no spaces in between these, so they are just joined. And the V is a capital, whereas this S will be a lowercase. The next one is snake case. Now this is a convention that is often used in Python for the naming of variables and functions and methods. In this one, everything is lowercase, but spaces are exchanged for underscores. So we could say something like sphere underscore volume. And that is the snake case. Another one will be Pascal case, and these ones are generally used for class naming. And this is where for every word, each first letter of every word is an uppercase. So we could say something like sphere volume, just like so. And those are the naming conventions. So this one here is your Pascal. Otherwise, it could be called upper camel case. This one is your lower camel case. And this one is your snake case. Now, I said earlier that variables obviously have to have a decent identifier. Functions and methods need to be a verb, i.e. doing something. So for example, if we have a variable called sphere volume, then odds are we want to calculate that. So what we could do is, if we are using the Python standard, is we say calculate underscore sphere underscore volume, just like so. And that would be a function where we would do the calculations in there. And that's it for that part. So that's what we mean by using a verb, i.e. it's doing something, because a function and a method does something. And that is the standard that we use in that case. Now in something like C#, it will differ. We would actually use Pascal case for that, or upper camel case as it's usually called. For stuff like class naming, we need to have a noun. For example, we could have a class that deals with all different types of shapes. So we might have a class name called shape, or something like that. You might have another one called game manager. Now here, the G and the M are in uppercase, so this is the Pascal case. So that is basically it for naming conventions. They differ depending on the language, but the general consensus here is that variables need to have a good identifier. For example, sphere volume, we know what that means. That's better than referring to sphere volume as num instead. That's no good. Our class names should be a noun, such as shape, game manager, and our functions should be a verb, which means they are doing something. So in this case, calculate sphere volume. And there we go. So hopefully that makes sense, and we'll see you in the next video.